Live NFL trivia every Tuesday night on Twitch at 9 p.m. Eastern. Come show off your football knowledge and have a chance to win cash prizes. Check the link in the description to find out more. And now, on with our feature presentation. NFL games can typically run longer than scheduled. It's one of the beauties and one of the pains of live sports. They don't always end when they're supposed to. When that happens, what do the television networks usually do? Well, they'll delay other programming and they'll make the necessary adjustments. If that means rescheduling a show, they'll do it. If that means cutting the news short or not having as many commercial breaks in future programming, they'll do it. We see this all the time, especially during football season, where if you're watching CBS on the East Coast on Sundays for 60 minutes, you know that it's not coming on at 7 o'clock, and know that its start time can vary. But in 1975, NBC faced this exact dilemma and decided to solve the problem in one of the worst and weirdest ways possible. It led to outrage across the Eastern time zone. It led to the phone lines being bombarded, and it may have even changed the way that we view television today. In 1975, after a game between Oakland and Washington, NBC made a decision so controversial that was the exact opposite of the infamous Heidi Game. And this is the story behind the reverse Heidi Game. Before I talk about the game itself and the decision that NBC made, we need some context to understand the television landscape back then, especially as it pertained to the National Football League. And to fully understand the reverse Heidi Game, it only makes sense to talk about the actual Heidi Game. There are plenty of videos and documentaries about this out there, so I'm not going to dive too much into the game, but here's a brief rundown of the original game that may have been the most influential sporting television moment ever, because after this, it completely changed how networks broadcast games. In 1968, NBC held the rights to the American Football League, and the network was televising a big game between the Oakland Raiders and the New York Jets. The Jets were leading the AFL East with a 7-2 record, and the Raiders were half a game back of the Kansas City Chiefs atop the AFL West with a 7-2 record. This was not a garbage matchup. This was arguably the biggest matchup of the entire season. The game started at 4 o'clock Eastern since it took place in Oakland, and NBC allotted 3 hours for the game, which makes perfect sense, especially back then when games didn't go more than 3 hours. However, there was a problem. This game was not going to finish in 3 hours. A ton of penalties, 19 in total, stopped the clock. There was a ton of scoring, which stopped the clock. The quarterbacks combined to throw 31 incomplete passes, which stopped the clock. The game was going to run overtime. At 7 o'clock, NBC was scheduled to air the family movie Heidi. The executives had a big decision to make. Do we wait until the game ends to show the movie, or do we stop the game at 7 o'clock and start the movie on time? With the Jets leading 32-29 with roughly 2 minutes left in the game, NBC, to the outrage of every football fan in America, cut the game to show the movie. Had the Jets held on to win it by that score, this probably just becomes a blip in football history and a mere footnote. But they didn't. The Raiders came back to score 2 touchdowns in the final minute, which no one saw, as they won the game 43-32. For fans who didn't watch Heidi and didn't see a poorly timed final score update at the saddest scene, they were stunned when they saw in the newspaper the next day that the Jets blew the game. I've talked at length about this game in a previous video of mine, so click the card in the upper right corner if you want to learn more about that. But this 1968 game was a win for families and children, and a loss for football fans. 7 years later, the football fans would get their revenge. There's another critical component to this story that is worth mentioning, and that is the rule change that was in place in 1975 that was not in place back in 1968. Back in 1968, it was incredibly safe to allot 3 hours to a game. The Jets-Raiders game was the exception. 3 hours for a game was about as safe of a bet as allotting 2 hours to a soccer game today. And the reason for that is simple. There was no such thing as overtime. In the regular season, if the game was tied after 60 minutes, that was it. The game just ended in a tie. Because of this, you never really had to worry about a game running over, because when the clock hit triple zeros, whatever the score was, that was it. But in 1974, the NFL changed all of that. The league decided to create a 15-minute sudden death overtime period if 2 teams were tied after 4 quarters. On paper, this should have raised eyebrows for television networks, since now, games were no longer guaranteed to be done in 3 hours. In actuality, nothing really changed. During the 1974 season, there were only 2 games that went into overtime. One of them was a Giants-Jets game that took place in the early slate of games, so it didn't interfere with any primetime programming. The other one was a Steelers-Broncos game that, while it wound up going the distance and ended in a tie, and while it was a later game so it interfered with primetime, it didn't cause any uproar at all. It delayed the start of Wild Kingdoms starring Marlon Perkins, which was about scientists doing shark research. I'm not sure how many people were huddled around their TV sets waiting for that one. And if it did delay the Wonderful World of Disney by a bit, that was only an hour long, so that would still easily be over by 9 o'clock on the East Coast. In short, NBC had no qualms whatsoever about the NFL playing overtime games. And that was good, because on November 23rd, just a few days before Thanksgiving, NBC was set to air Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. NBC first aired this on Thanksgiving back in 1974, hoping to make it a tradition of sorts. And the broadcast seemed to be a resounding success. It was so successful, in fact, that NBC decided to try the same thing the following year. The Sunday night time slot was a big deal back then, and whereas NBC usually showed a mystery movie, on this day, they were going to be showing a family-friendly classic. The NFL was playing at 4 o'clock, and Willy Wonka would be on at 7 o'clock. What could possibly go wrong? Well, oompa loompa doopity-dee, because trouble would be brewing for NBC. November 23rd, 1975. It's week 10 of the season, and we have an absolutely critical game on our hands between the Oakland Raiders and Washington. On one side, you have the visiting Oakland Raiders. They lead the AFC West with a 7-2 record. And while they should have the division locked up, as no one else is even above 500, they want to push for home field advantage, or at least a top 2 seed in the conference. Remember that in 1975, the NFL finally scrapped that awful system where the seeds were determined on a rotating basis, almost making regular season record completely meaningless. Oakland was in a dogfight with the 7-2 Dolphins, 8-1 Steelers, and 8-1 Bengals for the top seed in the conference. And then, we have the home team in Washington. They're 6-3 and are in a battle to make it back to the postseason and possibly repeat as conference champions. The Cardinals lead the division with a 7-2 record. They also have Dallas and Detroit at 6-3 fighting for the final spot in the postseason. Washington does not have a whole lot of room for error here with 5 games to go, especially after the Cowboys won their game earlier in the day to improve to 7-3. Both of these teams are well within the playoff push, as fans across the country were eagerly awaiting what was on paper one of the biggest games of the season. There was a ton of hype surrounding this one, and safe to say, the game lived up to all expectations and then some. Even though the Raiders jumped out to a 20-9 lead at the half and looked to be in control of the game, Washington came storming back. Oakland's offense, which was seemingly moving the ball at will thanks to 3 rushing touchdowns by Pete Banaszak in the first half, got nothing going in the second half, and could only muster up 3 more points. Washington capitalized on that, scoring on a 2-yard touchdown run by Mike Thomas in the third quarter, and then scoring late in the fourth on a 33-yard touchdown pass by Billy Kilmer to Frank Grant. This was a heck of a dogfight, with nothing separating these two teams from each other. And at the end of the fourth quarter, it was 23-all tied up. We were heading into overtime. And at this point, NBC began to panic. The NBC executives did not think that this game would run long and go into overtime. They thought they'd be out by 7 o'clock so the 2-hour Willy Wonka movie could air on time and be done by 9 o'clock. Now, they had a problem, because this game was not ending. What were the options that NBC had? Well, they could have cut away from the game and just do what they did with Heidi. The only problem with that? I think Raider fans would have burned the NBC building if that happened. If NBC screwed the Raiders over twice with close games, Raider fans would have been rightfully upset, and the NFL would have been absolutely furious. However, it didn't appear as though that option was ever on the table. Especially after what happened with Heidi, NBC was not going to cut away from a game to show other programming. The logical thing to do seemed to be to just start Willy Wonka as soon as the game ended. This meant that if the game ended at 7:40, the movie would start at 7:40. However, this posed a problem in the executives' eyes. Delaying programming is one thing when we're talking about content geared more towards adults, since they can stay up later. But with kids programming, especially 2-hour-long kids programming, it gets harder. Doing it like this would have meant that the movie would end at 9:40 p.m. For a lot of young kids, that's awfully late, and that's way past their bedtime. NBC executives were mindful of this, and they didn't want a whole bunch of angry parents phoning in and complaining that their kids couldn't get any sleep because they stayed up late to watch Willy Wonka. Or they didn't want parents complaining that they had to argue with their kids about bedtime because they promised that they could stay up until 9 o'clock to watch Willy Wonka, and now they had to give another 40 minutes. Because of this, NBC decided on what might have been the worst possible option. At 7:40, George Blanda hit the game-winning field goal for the Raiders, giving them a 26-23 victory, keeping them alive in the race for the number 1 seed and placing a huge dent in Washington's playoff chances. And immediately afterwards, NBC decided to show Willy Wonka. Except they cut out the first 40 minutes of the movie. We were just plopped right into the movie with the first third being completely scrapped. The Candyman song? Who needs it? The part where the kids find the tickets? Nah, that's completely irrelevant to the plot. Any character exposition and development involving Charlie and Grandpa Joe? Completely useless. We're just gonna show the movie without showing the first 40 minutes so that it ends at 9 o'clock on the dot. And safe to say, this did not end well at all. The good news for NBC was that they pleased football fans, and they made the right call by delaying Willy Wonka versus cutting away from an overtime game. As NBC spokesman Jack Van Buskirk said, there were a lot more calls complaining when the network cut away from Heidi versus when the network delayed Willy Wonka. The bad news was that they took the worst approach possible. Somewhere in the ballpark of 1,000 people across the Eastern time zone, which was the only time zone impacted by this, called the network to complain. And most of the complaints weren't about the late start time, but rather were about the fact that they cut out the first 40 minutes of the movie. Think of how confusing it is when you're dropped into the middle of a movie midway through, and you have no idea what's going on. And now, think about how confusing it must be for a small child to do that, especially one that had never seen the movie before. Apparently, kids were crying at the fact that they missed the first third of the movie. Some actual quotes from kids about the whole ordeal include, "We missed the most exciting part, the part where Charlie finds the golden number. That's kind of the most important part of the movie." Another kid said, "That's not fair. They have to show the beginning." One 3-year-old asked, "Where's the chocolate bar?" I have to agree with the 3-year-old here. Without knowing why these kids are at this safety violation-ridden factory, the movie doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And one 7-year-old said, quite bluntly, "I hate football." Honestly, after how NBC gypped you, I can't say I blame you. Fortunately for the kids, NBC would re-air the full movie on May 2nd, 1976, which was still a long time away, but at least that wasn't their only chance to watch the film. And it's a good thing that something like this wouldn't happen today. Today, if a show runs long, they just push back the other shows and figure it out from there. Joining a game in progress is somewhat unavoidable, and it happens from time to time. But joining a movie in progress? Not NBC's best idea. 7 years after the Heidi Game screwed NFL fans across the country, families and children learned what it was like to be on the other end of that. Because on this fateful 1975 day, the first 40 minutes of the movie were nothing more than pure imagination. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jg9shop.com, and be sure to like this video, ring the notification bell, and subscribe down below if you haven't already, as it helps the channel out a lot. And be sure to check out Twitch every Monday and Tuesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern for your chance to play NFL Trivia and win cash prizes. Link in the description below. If you want to see videos like this condensed down to 60 seconds, then follow me on TikTok at JaguarGator9 and subscribe to 60-Second NFL History on YouTube. To see highlight videos of players throughout the history of the NFL, subscribe to JG9 Highlights. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.